Welcome. This is the first of a two-part series on accessory dwelling units sponsored by Housing North. Today, we are going to have three speakers who are going to talk about the history of accessory dwelling units, how homeowners can create accessory dwelling units, also known as ADUs, if you're not familiar with that acronym, and also talk about some programs that are promoting ADUs in our region. So we'd like to remind everybody to please mute your speakers. And if you have questions, you can put them in the chat down below or wait until the time where we're going to accept questions and raise your hand. If you haven't used that hand icon before, it's at the bottom of your screen under reactions, and you just click it and we'll see that your hand is raised, and we can call on you later on when we get to those questions. So I'm going to introduce our speakers and give you a little bit of background on accessory dwelling units, and then we're going to get started with our first speaker. So our three speakers today are Steve Schnell. He is the Housing Ready Program Director in Charlevoix County. He has worked in the field of planning in Northern Michigan for over 20 years, including a position at Northeast Michigan Council of Governments. He is certified by the American Institute of Certified Planners. Steve has a master's degree in community and regional planning from Iowa State University. Also with us today is Mary Riley. She is a land use educator with Michigan State University Extension. She has over 20 years of experience in planning and zoning, including serving as the Mason County Zoning and Building Director for 14 years, as well as serving as a tribal planner in New Mexico. She has also worked in the private and nonprofit sectors as a planner. Mary holds a master's degree in community and regional planning from the University of Texas at Austin and a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Michigan. And she has been a guest speaker on numerous topics here in Northern Michigan. Rounding out our panel is Sean Winter, who is the planning director for Traverse City and has been in that role since 2021. He has an undergraduate degree from Western Michigan University and a master's degree in urban and regional planning from Virginia Commonwealth University. Sean worked in Acme Township as planning and zoning administrator, and also with Beckett and Rader as a professional planner prior to taking his position with the city of Traverse City. And I am Trudy Gala. I am the planning director here at Leelanau County, and I also serve as the director for the Brownfield Redevelopment Authority. I am a certified planner, and I've been with the county over 30 years now. So let's talk about why we are speaking about ADUs today. I attended the National Planning Conference in San Diego, which was held at the beginning of this month. And there were a lot of sessions on housing, including discussion about problems that communities are facing all over the country. ADUs were brought up many times, and there was encouragement from the speakers to look at ADUs in a new light and to also go back and look at your old zoning ordinances in your community to see what you used to allow, what has changed over the years so it's no longer allowed, or it is much more restrictive in terms of housing. And Mary is going to do a little bit of history on ADUs today, which will also enlighten you on some of those things. Some planners are referring to ADUs as the low-hanging fruit because these units can go in quicker than large housing developments, and the property owner already owns the land, so that cost does not have to be considered. They are units that are relatively small. They are cheaper to build than a single-family home, and they provide a lot of benefits, such as the owner can rent them out for additional income or have family members stay in them. The owner can move into the ADU and rent the main home. The community gets additional units, which may provide housing for their workforce or additional kids in the local schools. They can also be used by seniors who want to downsize into smaller units and get out of the home that they're living in, as well as they can stay close to family and friends instead of going into assisted living. So our seniors stay in the communities that they are familiar with. There are many benefits to consider, and our hope is this session will start the discussion at the local level so communities revisit ADUs as another housing option. What are communities doing with regard to ADUs? Well, at the National Planning Conference, I learned that California has changed their laws to allow ADUs anywhere that a single family residence is allowed. And some of the early numbers that they got back showing on these units show that more than 3/4 of these units are being used by family members. So they're not turning them into short-term rentals like some people suspected. Some communities have also started fundraising to help pay for some of the homeowners' cost if they put in an ADU. if they agree to certain terms for the rental of that unit, such as renting to veterans. And some communities allow ADUs as well as JADUs. If you haven't heard of that term, it's a junior accessory dwelling unit, which is a unit that's smaller than the accessory dwelling unit, but it's also allowed on site. So you could have a single family home, an ADU, and then a junior ADU all on the same parcel. So there's a lot of options out there for accessory dwelling units, and there's an increased interest across the country as well as this region to consider these for additional housing that can go in fairly quickly. I want to remind everyone today that we are talking about dwelling units, not accessory uses to the main use, such as a storage unit or a shed in the backyard. These are actual dwelling units and would be defined that way in the local ordinances. As we talked about this session and worked on bringing it to you, we also found that there are people in this region who would like to put in accessory dwelling units, particularly for family members and adult kids who are still living at home and cannot find a place to rent and cannot find something that they can buy. But they found out that they can't do it. The units are not allowed, or they're told that the only way they can have another unit is to split off the parcel and build another home. And that's not what they're looking for. So if the ADUs are the low-hanging fruit in our communities, then let's take a closer look at them and see what they can provide for housing options. We hope you enjoy this session today and take away some information that can be shared with your local community. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Steve.
Thank you, Judy. Good afternoon. I'm really glad to be here. Glad you all are here to talk about ADUs. As Judy said, the low-hanging fruit of housing is definitely appealing to a lot of us who have been struggling over the years to try to find housing solutions. For many years, housing funding from the federal and state level has dried up for the most part, although we're seeing some come back around through the American Rescue Plan. But for the most part, it's been more and more of a challenge every day, especially with increasing construction costs. So we need to look at every opportunity. And what's really interesting about this one, it's not a new use. I mean, it's something that we can talk about again because it's been here before. And I think understanding what Mary's going to share with you a little bit later, the history of ADUs, will help us all as we talk about ADUs in our communities and with our developers, to help them understand, and our neighbors too, help them understand why we have these in our backyards. They've been used through history. So it's really important to do this. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the environment, the housing data that's brought us here. So I'm going to share my screen. And back up just a little bit. I'm from Housing North. I'm the Charlevoix County Housing Ready Program Director. Housing North is a 10-county region. My focus is completely on Charlevoix County, although I hope to share what I've learned in my experience with others like we are here today. Our organization is funded by a number of different foundations and local communities. And I think it really helps as we roll out an accessory dwelling unit promotional program. These partnerships that we have as a Housing Ready program with boots on the ground and connections with housing solutions teams in our local communities is really going to help us quite a bit as we roll this out. Our partnership is with the City of Boyne City, East Jordan, City of Charlevoix, County of Charlevoix, Charlevoix County Community Foundation, and the Fry Foundation. And a lot of what we do is try to build capacity locally and try to lower barriers and zoning ordinances. Specific to ADUs, that's what we're doing a lot of, is sharing success stories with accessory dwelling units, trying to remove some of the myth and bias that goes along with higher density housing, which is essentially what this is slightly. So we've got these partnerships to help us with that. What brings us to looking at this, one of many housing solutions, I look at the analogy as we have a bucket that we want to be full of water, but we have about a dozen holes in the bottom of the bucket, and we're trying to plug as many of those holes as possible, trying to keep housing, trying to keep afloat and trying to keep supplying our housing in our communities. And there's a lot of different solutions, but there's quite a few holes in our bucket. There's a lot of demand out there that isn't being met. In this case, we did 2019, we did a housing target market analysis, and I think a lot of counties throughout the state had these done back in 2018, 2019. Ours did very specific studies down to the community level, but right now this is at the county level in 2019. This is annual demand that brings us to where we are today. 792 rental units in our county of 30,000, approximately 30,000 people, a little bit less, is where we are right now. And that's how many units could be absorbed into the market every year. And you can see in the rent price points, less than or equal to $650 a month is rather unrealistic. So we have a lot of work to do to create more housing rental opportunities. Just quickly show you some of the home ownership units to add to that demand that isn't being met. 400 home ownership units could be absorbed into our market every year. And again, as you look at the price points, they're quite unrealistic to what is available today. Housing prices are going up quite a bit, a lot more than median income, a lot more than housing unit production, a lot more than our employed persons population, and a lot more than the census home value. If you look at Zillow Home Value Index, which takes a little bit more into account actual sale prices of homes, you can see those rising. If it's indexed everything equal in 2012, you can see how much that's rising in relation to all the other indices in our communities. So what is affordable? $1,315 a month would be affordable rent for your average household, and that includes heating and plumbing and water and that type of thing. So if you have rent that doesn't include heat or electricity or something like that, you'd actually have to be paying less per month for rent. As an example, in our community, a house went up on Facebook Marketplace. A person that I know was putting that up for rent. And within 48 hours, that single family home, which is renting for a little bit more than that amount, had over 170 people apply with interest in that home. So I'm sure all of you can share stories like that. And again, you know, when we look at ADUs, they're not cheap. Nothing's cheap to build right now, but they're definitely cheaper than new homes. And if all we look at is the idea of building new homes in all our communities, you can see, like as an example, East Jordan, you look at the total numbers, only 2 homes were built in 2 years, in the last 2 years. And short-term rentals, though, were taking over 7 new short-term rentals. So 7 homes went away. Essentially, 2 new homes were built. One of those was a manufactured home that was pulled into one of the manufactured home communities. And the other one that was built ended up being a weekend home for people from downstate. So essentially, we had a net loss of 5 homes, and if you count it, the new one of those being a weekend home, we really had a net loss of 6 homes in that community. So demand is going up, supply is going down, and ADUs are really a great opportunity for us. Housing and jobs, this is also a no-brainer. I'm sure everybody understands that we're going to lose businesses soon if we don't have places to house the new employees. And as we talk about housing affordability trends related to those jobs, you can see, you know, a lot of the younger households in this case, especially the younger employees that are being recruited to local businesses, they're desiring more compact, mixed-use, walkable communities. And accessory dwelling units are a really great way near neighborhoods and city centers to create that kind of desirable housing type that would be appropriate for our younger households. 20% of our Michigan households are cost burdened, and that's an estimate. And in certain areas, it's probably a little bit higher, especially in some of our higher end resort communities up here, like City of Charlevoix. They only have 38% of their single family homes are lived in year round. So we're really struggling to get that year round rental. And if we talk about ADUs as an opportunity to create more year round housing and income for homeowners, this is obviously a great solution. So we have reduced rates of home ownership. We have more demand for smaller rentals. Again, this has to do with 2 different trends, both our aging population wanting smaller houses that have more accessibility. You know, a backyard cottage is really a great opportunity. It can be all one level. It can be smaller. People can rent out their main homes for more income. And also the younger households, it's typically a smaller household, and so they don't need as much. They're going to be a little more transient as they try to figure out where they're going to live next. New recruit to a local business. There's really a lot of opportunities. And also with the younger crowd, they have a higher percentage of student debt compared to what the rest of us had 10, 20, 30 years ago. So there's a lot pointing to ADUs. And again, similar to this, what I just talked about, the housing types, interest in smaller homes, smaller lots. There's a lower home ownership rate, and so higher demand for rentals. Slower rate of new construction for larger homes because there's more investment. So less investment for an ADU is an attractive opportunity. And then again, the aging population. So a lot of barriers. These are probably also very intuitive to those of us on the call today. The higher taxes, infrastructure costs. ADUs have lower infrastructure costs because typically you can even, like here in Boyne City, you don't have to create a new tap into the water or sewer connection. You can go through your main house. So ADUs there's a lot of things in ADUs that are part of that solution. In addition to that, we need to come up with better financing opportunities for these. There are some barriers there that we need to lower. Legislative or policy changes is what we're trying to do here locally, creating lower barriers to ADUs and local zoning ordinances so people understand that they're not a threat that a lot of people would perceive them to be. So this is we're not going to talk about all of these other things, but you can see in the list of things that we can do to help plug all those holes in our pail of water. There's land bank authorities, deed restrictions. These can play a role. A deed restriction requiring ADUs to be year-round residential in exchange for perhaps grant funds or funds that could help in that development if we can find some philanthropy to assist with that. Community land trust. There are community land trust opportunities. They could own and rent that. In fact, there's a program out of Portland, Oregon called Dweller. It's a private company that owns the accessory dwelling unit. They lease people's backyards and they manage it and they share some of the rent income from those. So there are a lot of different home ownership types, and there's a way for building trades. These often can be small enough to be transported down the roads. You can imagine a building trades program, constructing these in the schoolyard and being able to auction them off and have them go to the community for housing opportunities. I'm going to talk a little bit later in our program about a promotional program that we have that takes some of these and actually tries to push them out into our community. But I'm going to turn it over to Mary, and she's going to give you a little history for the ADU program.
All right, you seen my screen? Yeah. Yeah, okay, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Mary Riley, and I'm an educator with MSU Extension. If you have any questions about this program, please feel free to contact me at my email that you see there. And I'm going to briefly cover today, what is an ADU and a little bit about history, and then talk a little bit more about today's ADUs and some implementation considerations. But I'm pleased that Sean Winter is with us here today. He's going to take quite a bit of a deeper dive into the zoning and implementation experience with ADUs in Traverse City. So based on the Federal Housing Administration definitions, an ADU is a habitable living unit, which generally means, there's sleeping quarters, a cooking kitchen, and a bathroom. It can be created within or detached from a single family dwelling unit with which constitute a single real estate interest or a single interest in real estate. So I underline that because I think it's important. It kind of, it sort of ties together this notion of principal and accessory. But as Steve just alluded to, there's some other kinds of things that are coming down the pipe about potentially, leasing an ADU or some different things like that. But what I want to most point out here is that look at all the configurations that ADUs come in. Maybe they're internal to the building. They can be a detached ADU. They can be the top level, the basement level, a converted garage or above the garage. So you can see there's many different forms that ADUs can take. The AARP has developed the ABCs of ADUs. It's a nice little document. So I highly recommend going and taking a look at that. That's where I got this image from. So we're going to launch a poll here shortly, an ADU by another name. So Yarrow, if you want to launch that, what is another name for an ADU? Check all that apply. Hopefully you're seeing the poll. You're like, oh, I didn't know this was going to be interactive. All right, the answers are flooding in. Guest cottage, in-law suite, carriage house, accessory apartment. All right, I'm gonna end the poll and share the results. It looks like you guys are you're all in the know. So ADUs come in a lot of other names, and these are often referred to as sort of these historic types of development that we had in terms of the guest house, the in-law suite. The carriage house certainly has more of a historic feel to it. All right, stop sharing. Thanks for that. So some of you might be asking, especially where there are internal ADUs, right, inside of that single family dwelling, what's the difference then between an ADU and a duplex? So I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole on that, so just bear with me. But so I decided to look up the definition for a duplex and among different communities. So Traverse City, this is Traverse City's definition. A building or buildings designed for occupancy exclusively by two family units. So in Traverse City, a duplex can actually be two separate buildings or one building housing dwelling units. In Ann Arbor, a detached building containing two dwelling units, but not including two otherwise freestanding single family units that are attached at one point or by a non-structural decorative feature. So in Ann Arbor also, they can be a duplex in one building, or they can be detached but attached by some kind of a decorative feature. And then finally in Mason County, where I work, just because I knew this definition, it's two dwelling units that are totally separated by an unpierced wall or ceiling, which implies, more of that attached duplex for sure. And so this is one point to check in your ordinance, maybe how you consider a duplex and how that might interface with ADUs or your intention for ADUs. Another common question is an ADU another name for a tiny house? Yes or no, if you want to enter that into the chat. What do you think? Yes, yeah. So some people ask, if we allow ADUs, does that mean we have to allow those tiny houses too on wheels? Or yeah, maybe. So it's not really known. So let's talk about that. So generally speaking, ADUs tend to fall in this 400 square feet to 1,000 square feet or a percentage of the principal dwelling. But it's determined by the local unit, what that size is. But the International Code Council, or this is part of the building code, they adopted an Appendix Q, which defines a tiny home as a dwelling that is 400 square feet or less in floor area, excluding lofts. So I think that's a good kind of a pivot point for a community to differentiate perhaps between a tiny home and an ADU. And it's always a good idea if zoning regulation is aligned with the building official, the building code interpretation. And so you can just be clear about permitting going forward in terms of if you will want to allow a tiny house that's generally more under that 400 square feet, and an accessory dwelling unit tends to be over that amount. And so in thinking about the ADU or duplex, and it might not always be clear, but the ADU tends to be, it may or may not be rented, and it could be just private use only. A fundamental aspect is it's typically is accessory to a single family dwelling, but we'll talk more about that because there's other kinds of accessory housing related to employment. They tend to be smaller in size and value than the principal dwelling. They are a dwelling unit. They're typically not sold separately either. They come as one real estate interest along with that principal dwelling. And what doesn't really matter either way is the address, utility meters. You know, they could have their own address or not. They could have their own utility meters or not. They could be attached to the main house or not, et cetera. They can also have a shared well or septic, or separate well and septic. It can go either way. Kind of depends on the capacity, but that's one of those potential cost sharing aspects of an ADU too, is if there's capacity in the well and, you know, septic systems, that they can be used, but it depends on the number of bedrooms and that kind of thing. The second, the ADU or the duplex, excuse me, that there's a lot of it depends with a duplex in terms of if it's a condominium or if it's just a duplex on a single property. But most importantly, that second unit is legally recognized by the local unit of government, you know, as a separate habitable unit. So some nuances there. It was just kind of interesting to think about those differences. So going on to kind of talk about the form of, you know, an ADU, I got onto realtor.com and did some sleuthing and was kind of surprised by some things. So do you think this unit has an ADU just by looking at the picture here? What do you think? Yes or no? You can enter that in the chat also if you'd want. No, it really doesn't look like. Yeah, we're seeing mostly no's in the chat. So I was surprised to see this little unit here attached to the back of this dwelling. So the title of this program was Invisible ADUs, right? And so it's very clear that the ADU can be not visible from the road at all, depending on how it's configured. Here's another one. You don't need to enter it into the chat. I'm going to give you the answer shortly, but this is a house in Traverse City. And from the front, well, it looks like a house, right? And this is the back. So take note that, you know, if you could have these accessory dwellings, it looks the same from the road. So the form of the dwelling is maintained in these cases. And it's likely that the ADU is most often revealed from the alley or the back, but not from the street. So perhaps this, again, sheds light on this idea of an invisible ADU. Now, in this case, you know, ADU or duplex, well, it's pretty clear it's a duplex, right? Very similar in size. They're attached, similar value. But in this case, they were selling it as, you know, a single unit. So perhaps this is just a duplex. It's 2 units, but it's on actually one single property. This one I thought was a little bit tricky. And, you know, from looking at it, I thought, well, it could be all 3. You know, it could be a single family dwelling, but that exterior staircase probably gives it away, that there's at least a second unit on that top floor. It'd be kind of unusual for a single family dwelling to have that exterior staircase, but this could be, you know, a multifamily also. So again, just underscoring that form that ADUs can really blend in and appear as a single family dwelling when they're internal or attached ADUs. So by internal ADUs, this is examples again from the AARP document, but on the lower one, the orange house there, you can barely make out a door frame on the staircase there. And the other one is a basement ADU. So presumably you go in and then go down the stairs in the orange building on the top. So interesting examples. So also on realtor.com, right, with this duplex, it's just this half is for sale. of the duplex. So don't forget about condominiums in terms of duplexes and forms of ownership, and maybe being able to sell one off from the other just in that duplex context. So I just wanted to point that out because Sean and we were talking earlier before this, and with detached duplexes, sometimes in Traverse City, they're condoed, and then one can be sold separately from the other. So I don't bring this up to confuse you. I just bring it up to say, check your ordinances and kind of think through the nuances of your definitions for either multifamily or duplex, and making sure you're allowing space for ADUs. Okay, so as we learned from our poll before, we know that ADUs come by many other names. As Steve mentioned, these are not new, right? These were relatively common in the 1800s and probably right up through the middle of the century. As a society, or as Americans, I think we became quite focused in terms of, anyways, land use on that single family dwelling after World War II. And financing options and banks also started to focus more heavily on that single family dwelling unit in order to get a mortgage. And so let's look at all the ways that ADUs showed up historically. So on the upper left, there is a parsonage from a church and a parsonage. So that would be an ADU that's related to employment. On the upper right is the Island House on Mackinac City. They still have employees living in the Island House, because where else would a lot of employees wouldn't be able to work on Mackinac Island if it were not for the employer actually offering housing. On the lower left is sort of that carriage house model in Manistee, a vineyard, caretaker in Farmington Hills. And I included the lighthouse there. In a way, the lighthouse keeper's house is accessory to the lighthouse, right? That might be the principal use of that property. And they needed a place for folks to stay in remote and rural areas in order to have that kind of job. And so we know that, farm labor, large farms and estates, it was very, very common to have accessory dwellings and multiple dwellings on one parcel back in the day. So this is not new. We're just kind of trying to roll back time a little bit and honor that there was a need for that, for all the things that Trudy brought up, right? Some of those intergenerational challenges of kids or parents, employment needs, temporary housing needs, all kinds of things. So in addition to what you've seen earlier, let's consider some other forms. So agricultural housing is something we haven't really touched on, but there also is a need for agricultural workforce housing. And that can take many different forms. So like the white buildings you see on the top there. And then below is Peterson Farms. And Peterson Farms is a large agricultural processor in Oceana County. And they recently constructed several apartment style multifamily single-story buildings to address worker housing. And in order to retain workers, they needed to provide affordable housing. They really didn't have any other option. And so in some cases, it's the employer who's taking an active role in providing housing for workers in order to make sure their business can operate. On the right, there's a few other different types of ADU models that we haven't talked about yet. The park model on the upper right is actually classified as an RV. There's lots of different interesting park models, but those can go down the road, just like Steve was mentioning. And they come fairly fully finished and constructed. So all you need to do is hook up mechanical, electrical, plumbing, and so forth. And then on the bottom right is a plan for an ADU above a garage, which is a nice option for those that maybe want some separation from the principal residence. And some communities are going so far as to offer pre-approved architectural drawings to people as a way to provide perhaps a more cohesive design that, what the community wants, but it also helps to defray costs, those soft costs associated with construction. And that would help an individual save some money and get them in better footing to get a building permit. And that could mean thousands of dollars of savings just to have those pre-approved plans. So some of the larger cities, I think Portland and Seattle and some others, I think, well, South Bend, not for ADUs, but for houses, but communities are getting into this realm of having pre-approved plans and offering them for free to folks. So we're just talking about ADUs today, but I want to offer a few other options for you to consider in addition to ADUs. So, allowing the ADUs by right, either attached or detached, and all of those configurations that we showed earlier. Thinking about allowing up to 4 dwelling units per lot. Reducing minimum parcel size, that's more of a rural strategy, and some communities have 10-acre minimums right now, and just the land alone means that person there'll be a severe limit on the new dwellings that are constructed. And I know that's a sensitive issue when you have agriculture, but we need to be thinking about that. And adopting inclusive standards for farm worker housing and so forth. So another thing I want to suggest, and Sean's going to talk again more about implementation, but I think it's important for what I'm calling the team, which would be the addressing, the assessing, the building official. So as you're thinking about ADUs and how you want to amend the ordinance, just making sure that everyone's kind of on the same page. And so when a person that wants to get an address for their ADU, they can do that. They won't hit a roadblock and say, no, we can't give you an address. There's only one address per parcel, those sorts of things, trying to prepare for that. And making sure that you can allow more than 1 dwelling unit per parcel without creating a new parcel. Trudy alluded to that earlier, that somebody hit a roadblock with that. And so even though your zoning allows it, make sure your land division person knows, make sure the assessor knows, right? That you're all on board so people aren't hitting these like little bits of friction as they go through the process. And then also determining your threshold size. That could be important, and it's entirely up to the community, but again, kind of being in concert with the building official on those thresholds. Finally, be prepared to be flexible over the life of the ownership of that ADU. There's probably going to be combinations of things that person wants to do or a subsequent owner wants to do. So maybe it's short-term rental for a while, followed by long-term rental. Maybe it's a long-term employee use or seasonal employee use with short-term rentals in the shoulder seasons or something like that. And so I think that's important with ADUs that we provide that flexibility. And finally, ADUs could be accessory to other things. Institutional, churches, hospitality, industrial, commercial, right? Think back to that, some of those historical pictures, the fact that employers are having a very difficult time finding places for folks to work. Finally, I want to bring up that considering an owner occupancy requirement, for some communities, it may give some comfort to think that the principal resident or a long-term resident of the community will be living on that parcel. So maybe they give up their principal residence for some time of the year to rent that out, but they're staying in the ADU or vice versa. But make sure that you're also thinking about the staffing that would be needed to enforce this. If this is maybe enforced through a deed restriction or it's enforced through an annual licensure of some kind. But think through the fairness element too. If you're treating long-term rentals and short-term rentals differently, just just be thinking through that, because maybe you have other STR ordinances on the books and that kind of thing. So you want to bring that into the fold. That's something you're already doing. So this is done in communities. I'm just saying approach with caution, but it's definitely something that's done if it needs to happen in your community just to get ADUs through, and it brings some level of comfort that is an option. So key points, ADUs aren't new. We're recycling a very good old idea. They can be relatively invisible if they're internal. Those external detached ADUs arguably are not invisible, but perhaps those can be, behind the home always, and they'll be more visible from the back or the alley if you're in a more of a city type setting. And then gain some clarity on details that we talked about. You don't need to get lost in the details, but just gain some clarity on what is what's the same, what's different. Get your team on board so that permitting can be relatively flexible. And then finally, be flexible with the owner needs. So there was a survey done in the Pacific Northwest of ADU owners conducted by AARP, and 60% of those respondents said that they greatly value flexibility in the use of their ADU. So again, this is all a local decision, and if your community wants to have no restrictions on ADUs, that's certainly an option. So MSU does have some housing curriculum available if you're interested. Your community wants to take a deeper dive and do a 1 hour or a 3 or 4 hour programming on planning and zoning for affordable housing. And these are the references that I referred to in the program. And I will turn it over to Sean Winter from Traverse City, and he can give us some more detail on implementation.
All right, thank you very much, Mary. Let me just take a minute here to get my presentation queued up, if I may. Sorry about that, everyone. How's that? Are you able to see it on the screen? Okay, thanks again. My name is Sean Winter. I'm the planning director for the city of Traverse City, and I was asked to describe our evolving history and level of success that we've had with accessory dwelling units over the years. So to give a little background of our community, we are quite small at under 9 square miles. We have over 15,000 people that live here in the city. That swells each day to about 35,000 with the workers that migrate in, balanced with those migrating out. We serve as the urban core to the 150,000 Grand Traverse micropolitan statistical area as defined by the Census Bureau. Currently, we have approximately 6,400 dwelling units in our city. I want to point out, because I think this is an interesting fact for our community, that almost 11% of our dwellings do not own a vehicle. So we hear a lot about housing and parking and the need to accommodate all that, when the reality is we have a probably disproportionately high percent of people that rely on transit and walking and biking as their primary form of transportation. Like many communities in northern Michigan, we have a large tourism and service-based industry sectors, and we experience significant seasonal swings in our population due to all the visitors. One thing that we're noting, and probably many of you are too, is that that season is getting longer as it's starting to spill into the shoulder seasons from what it used to be. So we are located at the north end of Grand Traverse County along the Grand Traverse Bay. Our community is kind of divided by Boardman Lake in the middle, but it's also where the Boardman River exits out into West Grand Traverse Bay. We're also home to the area's largest airport, medical facility, and community college. So a lot of different reasons for coming into the community. So to start with our history, we started allowing ADUs in 1999. So that was when a new ordinance was adopted, whole new zoning ordinance rather. So from 1999 to 2007, we allowed temporary ADUs through a special land use permit. There was a subjective standard in that you had to have a demonstrated need in order to get this approved. An example of those needs could be an aging parent that couldn't live independently anymore, or perhaps an adult child who had disabilities and couldn't live independently, but it had to have some sort of need. This process required a public hearing before the planning commission, where all property owners within 300 feet would be notified, then going to the city commission where another public hearing was held. And the real kicker there is once that need no longer existed, you had to decommission the ADU, which typically meant ripping the kitchen out of it. So it was a kind of a waste of investment in some ways. And it's probably no surprise that under this restrictive regulatory framework in that time period, only one ADU was actually constructed. Then in 2007, they did a revision to the ordinance and they piloted an overlay district in one neighborhood. We call this neighborhood Traverse Heights. They removed the demonstrated need, so that no longer was a requirement. And it didn't have to be temporary. Once built, it could be allowed to exist, but it still required that special land use permit where you had to go to the planning commission with a public hearing and again, the city commission. And just as a side note, it's really not best practice to have your land use approvals decided by elected officials. That brings politics into what should be a very predictable process. So even with that, we only had 3 ADUs in that time period. Now, again, it was restricted to one neighborhood. And this kind of frustrates me because it's our, I'd say our least historic neighborhood, or it's been built out the most recent. It's also a neighborhood that is more blue collar workers and probably a lower median income and lower price point. And all too often in our community, we hear, yeah, we support that in Traverse Heights. Oh yeah, we'll put it over there, but not elsewhere. And I think that creates an equity issue that needs to be part of that conversation. So then in 2015, we did a major ordinance overhaul to our ADUs. We changed them to become a use by right in all zoning districts. So no more city commission, planning commission approval, just approved by staff if all the standards were met. However, it must be on a lot with a single family home. It did require a license by the city, and kind of as a compromise, they initially started with a maximum of 10 licenses per year so that we could kind of monitor the implementation of this new program. The property needs to be significantly conforming in order to have an ADU. The minimum rental period is 90 days because we do not allow short-term rentals in our residential districts. And the owner must live on site. Now they can either live on the ADU or they can live in the main dwelling. So when the community was going through this process, obviously there was a lot of concerns that we heard expressed. And I'll just kind of run through them. And they're probably the ones that you would expect most often. Parking, perceived negative impact of density, parking, nuisances, which we already regulate, like trash and noise, parking, neighborhood character, parking, short-term rentals, parking, privacy, parking, and erosion of single-family neighborhoods, which there's a lot of potential opposition to that. I reiterate parking so much because we don't allow parking on our city streets overnight. So all parking has to be accommodated off-site anyways. So it's really not an issue. Then in 2021, just to add to it, we eliminated all parking requirements for any residential use. So we don't even consider parking when we're looking at ADUs or houses or multifamily and anything like that. I will say this, we've never had one permitted that didn't have parking because people realize that some people may want a parking spot in the future and therefore it needs to be included to be marketable and used. So we did another little amendment like in 2016 to it, some tweaks. And then in 2018 was the last time that we revisited this again. We added some additional special requirements. The number of licenses issued each year was bumped up to 15. Then we added some design standards. So you can only have one entrance on the front facade of the house. So if it's an internal ADU or an attached ADU, they either need to be accessed through that same front door or a door on the side or rear. So it kind of maintains, as Mary pointed out, that single family look from the street. The exterior stairs, if you have them going up to an upper level, they can't be in the front of the house. They have to be in the side or rear. Maximum of 800 square feet. That's one difference between an attached ADU and a duplex, is that the duplex doesn't have a maximum square footage for its size. Maximum height of 25 feet or the height of the principal building. And you have to use similar building materials, design elements, and roof pitches as the principal building so that there's some cohesion there. And that's understandable why these were added because, as they started implementing ADUs, we're getting some oddball situations. So in the background, you can see the principal structure. This is looking from the alley, so you're seeing it from the rear. It's a tan house, very typical roof pitch for this area. And then this is the ADU that was built in the back. So it's very disconnected in aesthetic from the actual house. We also had some that were disproportionate in scale. So on the right, you're seeing the principal structure, which is a modest single family home. And then on the the back of the house, or the back of the lot, you have this very large accessory dwelling unit with a detached garage, which essentially dwarfs that house. But through those changes, starting in 2015, we were actually starting to experience success. So since 2015, we have permitted 78 accessory dwelling units. I think that number would be higher if we didn't have a cap on them. So in 2015 and 2016 and 2017, we hit our max. In fact, we had a waiting list. It says 9 in 2017 because one never went through with building it and their permit expired. So in 2018, about halfway through, that's when they increased it to 15. And we had 13 that year. We had 11 the 2 next year. Last year, we had 8. And I think a lot of that decrease was tied to the availability of contractors and the price of building materials. It's kind of put people on pause. And then this year so far, we've already permitted 5 accessory dwelling units. So we map these on our internally facing dashboard using GIS, so we know where they're all located, and this gets updated by our GIS department every time we get a new one in there, so we can see where they're operating in case we get any complaints. This helps with enforcement. And then I want to go to that conversation about detached versus attached. Of the 78 ADUs that we have in our town, 69 of them are detached, and I think this is largely a function of how our community is built out. So we have a very traditional plat pattern with tight grids and alleyways. And so when you have an alley, we don't allow driveways in the front. This results in detached driveways off the alley in the rear. So more often than not, what happens is that detached building gets a second floor built above it, and that's where the ADU is occupied. This also kind of creates a greater sense of separation between the 2 dwelling units, and it also helps preserve more yard space. Our accessory buildings also have a more beneficial setback, if you will. So it's only 4 feet from the rear property line and 4 feet from the side property line, as opposed to if you built it out as part of your principal structure, you have to abide by the 25-foot rear setback. And then we have 6 to 8 foot side setbacks. We do a aggregate of 14 with one side not being less than 6. So what I'd like to do now is just go through and show you some examples from our community of the ADUs that we have around. Again, you'll see a pattern here that most of these are all detached. In fact, it's really hard to get meaningful pictures of the attached ones because you don't even know really that they're there unless you count a second mailbox or see a random door in the back. But we have quite a few, and I think they add a lot of valuable architecture and character to the neighborhood, especially with those standards that we have in there now that they got to kind of match that principal house. Here's one located off the back. Again, you're typically seeing these on the upstairs of a detached garage. And some of them can be quite grand, like this one. This probably cost more than my house to build this ADU right here in this large garage and all the quality building materials that they use on site there. These also work on waterfront lots. You know, that doesn't have to be a problem. Here we have one on Grand Traverse Bay. In that case, we allow accessory buildings to be street side of the principal structure. So we would allow a detached garage in the same way that we would allow an accessory dwelling unit. And so now I want to show some slides real quick of how the accessory dwelling unit really blends with the principal dwelling unit. So on the left of each of these, you'll see the accessory building. On the right, you'll see the principal one. And so in this case, on the right, you can see it kind of tastefully tucked back behind the main house, similar roof pitch, building materials, colors. This can work on very modern homes as well. So here's one of our more modern examples. On the left is the ADU. On the right is the principal structure. It can work also on more traditional homes. So if you look right here, this, if you can see my slide on the ADU, this decorative millwork that we have up here was put in to match what we have on the house, similar vent pattern, similar construction materials. And it also works in our historic districts, which add another layer of review to this, which is beneficial for those districts. But again, just because you have a historic neighborhood doesn't mean you can't properly and tastefully execute ADUs within them. So some potential future revisions that we may incorporate, or at least discuss at the Planning Commission level, have been identified. One is eliminating the annual cap. As I mentioned earlier, it's arbitrary. There's no basis for why it's at 15. The argument has been, well, you haven't hit the cap recently. Why would you need to eliminate it? Well, we get calls every week in our office about ADUs, and we firmly believe that just the presence of a cap is a deterrent to people, because it does cost a lot of money to get those plans together, only to find out that someone else beat you to the punch and reached the last possible license available that year, making you wait. It becomes extra complicated now, because if you've tried to do any projects with contractors in the last year, just trying to coordinate that is a real challenge. So if someone's in a position to go, I think we should let them go. Plus, we've recognized that we have a crisis in terms of a housing shortage. We also recognize that ADUs are an appropriate type of housing in our community. So if we had 17 people one year that had the desire and means to address this issue by building an ADU, why would we want to tell 2 of them they have to wait till next year to help address this solution or this problem? There's a disconnect there in that thinking. We may discuss no longer requiring owner occupancy. I could buy a duplex in our town right now and rent out both units without having to live there. So if I have a rental unit that's a single family home and I want to build a ADU on there to rent out and provide housing for someone else, how is that different than what we're already allowing? Another thing, and Mary mentioned this, where we have duplexes, whether attached or detached, we allow them to be condominiumized and sold independently of one another. It may be worth looking at the ability to do that with the ADU as well, because that provides a more affordable point of entry to possibly purchase a detached ADU than a whole single family house into our communities. And when you think about it, the greatest way to build personal wealth and financial stability, or not the greatest way, but one of the fundamental ways, is through the equity that you can build in your home. But we don't have a lot of homes at those price points that can be purchased. We always talk about rentals. Maybe we need to start talking about ownership as well. We have been having the discussion about pre-approved building plans, as Mary also mentioned, maybe having 2 or 3 on deck that anyone could use and just get the permit and move forward with. It does get a little complicated with the way our ordinance is written, because we have a lot of diversity in our housing stock, and we got that requirement that the ADU needs to somewhat match the principal home. So it'd be hard to have something pre-approved that can work everywhere unless the community is willing to forego the similarities in their designs, which I don't think would be the case. We've also talked about allowing 2 ADUs on larger lots, perhaps if they're twice the minimum lot size. And again, we have water and sewer everywhere, so we don't have to deal with the septic issues that may limit that as a possibility. And I also talked about permitting ADUs on lots with duplexes. And the reason I bring this up is because here's the map of the 1943 zoning ordinance. This was the first year that the city decided to start regulating its land uses through the adoption of this ordinance. I've colored every section of the city where by right 2 or more dwelling units were allowed. And as you can see, it's the majority of the city. So only up here at the base of Old Mission Peninsula, and right here as you're going out onto Leelanau County, those are the only places where we had exclusive single family zoning. So that was the anomaly, not the norm, when we started regulating the land uses. And that's created the development pattern and the character of the neighborhoods that we love so much. So when we say like, hey, adding duplexes or ADUs is going to disrupt the character, the reality is it is our character. And that is why we look the way we do today. It's interesting to read back the reports and staff memos. It was in 1978 that they downzoned much of the city. And the reason they did that, when you read it, is they wanted to be more competitive with the subdivisions that were being built out in the township. So they increased the minimum lot size and went to single family zoning to mimic the development pattern that was out in the townships. And frankly, I think that's part of the reason of where we are, that's catching up to us now, because we restricted our ability to develop housing for the decades leading to today. And because of the fact that we allowed 2 or more dwelling units on so much of our city properties, all those red dots are individual lots that have 2 or more dwelling units already. And we're not talking about ADUs, we're talking about legally non-conforming duplexes, or in some cases up to 6plexes. So by saying we're not going to allow an ADU on a lot that has a duplex that, for all intent and purposes, looks like a single family home, we're eliminating the potential in all of those lots. And it's something like 138. And these are just the ones that have come in and gotten non-conforming certificates from us. There are more than this out there. We just are mapping the ones that we've issued it to. So lastly, some considerations. I just want to reemphasize that ADUs are a great way to gently add housing in your residential districts. After all, we've decided that these districts are for residential uses, so that's where we should maybe be adding them. Don't regulate them to the point that people won't pursue building them. You saw that in the beginning of our history of ADUs. We made it so restrictive that people just weren't pursuing this option. I would say don't create requirements that are substantially above and beyond what applies to single family homes. This is just another type of dwelling. There was conversations at one point of, well, maybe we should regulate where the windows go on the ADU. And like, we would never do that with a single family home. So why should this be treated differently? It is housing another family unit. I would consider just across the board eliminating minimum dwelling size, or at the very least exempt ADUs from minimum dwelling size, so that doesn't become a hurdle. As you go through this process, listen to the community's concerns, hear them out, have conversations with them. We all know that there will be people that facts don't matter, that they're just wanting to be heard. And so you need to listen to them, but also frame the conversation on the external benefits of ADUs. Like many of you probably are having also an issue with childcare in terms of availability and affordability. And I know one family here in town that has 3 children and they needed childcare because they both work. But trying to get someone to watch is difficult with the housing situation. So they built an ADU and it was a win-win. The nanny lives in the ADU and provides childcare when they go to work each day. So again, there's lots of solutions that these can bring. Also, like in terms of our community, when you allow density in the neighborhoods that are close to where people work and engage in commerce, there's a greater likelihood that they're able to walk to those locations or ride a bike. This in turn reduces pollution and emission. It put more eyes on the street, which increases public safety. It builds greater social strength when neighbors get to pass by each other on the sidewalks. It means less congestion because people aren't forced to drive everywhere, which in turn means we have smoother traffic flow and frankly, less parking lots needed and the impervious surfaces that come with them. And lastly, don't be afraid to allow them. They are a great tool. We've used them in this country, especially in this area for a long time. And you can always amend the ordinance as you move forward to address the unforeseen outcomes. We've done that a number of times. And the first thing we need to do is take a step forward. And since then, we've been finding ways to make it better and better and better. And we're experiencing, as I said earlier, success in that venue. So with that, I think I will hand it back to Steve.
Thank you so much, Sean. I really appreciate that. I know I'm sharing the right screen. I've learned a lot from Traverse City and from all your experience there. Having done this for so long, I find it rather fascinating about as to the requirements that you had a long time ago and how you actually began to encourage them and what restrictions, removing which restrictions was most helpful. So that's been hugely helpful. Mary also mentioned earlier to start considering about other types of uses like institutional and industrial uses that this could be part of. And before I get into our specific promotional program, as kind of a parallel effort here in our communities, specifically in Boyne City, starting to talk with the Planning Commission about allowing ADUs of sorts in the industrial park. If we have multinational corporations that own more and more of the industry in our community, and they bring people in from overseas to stay for a period of time, they want to recruit new employees who can't find housing right away. And the idea of allowing apartments within the industrial buildings or at the periphery of the industrial park has been something that they're a little cautious about because it's a new thing. So everybody's taking it kind of easy, but they're at least entertaining the idea. Specific to this program, we're looking at, again, based off the education and the information that I've learned from Traverse City and from other areas around the country, we're doing an ADU promotional program. And we haven't rolled it out completely yet. We're still waiting for our architectural drawings to come in. It's been a busy construction year for everybody. But when they're done and ready, they will be reviewed by our building official, our county building official. In this case, we have all of our inspections done at the county level. All of our zoning administrators will have a chance to look at this, and there will be 2 designs. One of them is on your screen here, and it's the carriage house design. The other design that we're going to be providing is a cottage design. So it's a single-story standalone structure that could be placed in somebody's backyard. And these would be architectural drawings, construction level drawings, and that can be turned in for permits and handed over to a contractor to build from. And we'll be providing them free of charge to anybody that's willing to do this as a year-round rental for family on their property. On the right-hand side of the image here, you see just sample zoning maps that we have. We're going to be providing this both online and in booklet format. You could download this as a PDF, but I also have it on GIS available for when people are interested. I can pull up their property and very quickly indicate whether or not they're on a piece of property where the local community at the local zoning level allows for an ADU on their property. So in addition to those functions, we have a whole toolbox of support that we're trying to provide to help people make the choice to have an ADU on their property. So going through what is an ADU exactly, the pros and cons of this, so they're going into it eyes wide open. Like I said, the zoning that goes along with that, I'll be providing zoning permit support. So that's often a foreign concept for many people. With my planning and zoning background, I'm happy to do the zoning permit for them. They would review it, sign it, and hand it in, but I can help them understand what the zoning permit's all about. Go through the approval process outline with them so that they understand what's going to be involved, both zoning, construction code. Maybe hopefully there's not a special use permit, but in some cases we still have that. And holding their hand through that process, and then turning them over to the local bank and helping them connect with, in our case, Charlevoix State Bank, which is a very community-oriented bank, and their understanding of this type of financing for this, and very, very willing to help out and do consultation with anybody considering this type of thing. And then, of course, connecting with local contractors. Most are very busy, but helping them understand and sharing with our local Builders Association these plans and this opportunity. So hopefully we can recruit some of the newer or smaller contractors to really specialize in this. And then also a guidebook on somebody else's guidebook already produced on how to be a landlord. What's the legal ramifications of doing this? How are you going to protect yourself? How are you going to be fair to your renters? How are you going to enforce your rental requirements? And then contacts to people who who can provide some resources for somebody considering this. So, like I mentioned, free architectural construction drawings. Each one is valued at almost $5,000. We got the money to pay for those 2 drawing sets through our local community foundation. Zoning guidance, we can help do the property layout, go out there and measure it. We have a pre-development fund available through our community foundation if they don't know where their property lines are, and it would encourage year-round workforce housing. We can provide some funding to help them with perhaps to hire a surveyor if need be. And then, of course, permitting assistance, and then those other services that I've mentioned already. So again, haven't rolled it out yet, but we're looking forward to doing this and just to hold hands and do everything we can. It's still very expensive. Obviously, everybody understands the construction costs are very high still, but do everything we can to make it as easy as possible for people to make this choice. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Yarrow, who's going to say just a little bit about Housing North and things that are available.
Hi, everyone. Let me just change my view here so I can see who's on the call. I don't have a whole lot to add. I think right now we'll just open it up for questions first and just kind of see. I saw one in the chat. Steve, and if you could maybe help me answer that or others, but it was related to the impact of the short-term rental bill. And how we, how that, just maybe we could speak a little bit to that. Let me just read the question. What is the anticipated impact of House Bill 4722 and Senate Bill 04466 on regulating short-term rentals for ADUs?
Yeah, that's a good question because that is having an impact. It's having an impact at the local level when I'm working with a local township, city or village planning commission, talking to them about reducing some of their barriers to housing. ADUs is one of many regulations that would allow for more housing, where people are thinking, well, you know, if House Bill 4722 goes through, this means that everything we do to relax regulations to allow for more housing would actually relax regulations that would also allow for more short-term rentals. So it makes them more hesitant and less likely to approve housing-friendly zoning ordinance regulations. So I have shared that. I'm sure it was not a predicted outcome of some of this House Bill 4722. So I've shared that with some of the bill sponsors and some of our local legislators, and it did surprise them that this was what was happening. But I do hope that 4722 doesn't go through, because, I mean, for many reasons, but this one in particular would have a negative effect on our housing supply and future housing opportunities.
Well, and Steve, maybe, do you want to just mention the deed restriction program briefly? And I mean, do you think that could be one way, because it is a requirement or a part of enrolling in your ADU program, that other communities could consider that as a tool?
Yeah, definitely. I think we're doing a deed restriction program. We have 5 units right now that are deed restricted in and around the city of Charlevoix. Some of them have been donated. One of them received a small amount of money to help make the deal happen. The money came from philanthropy. And that deed restriction requires year-round residential use of that property. It has to be their primary residence. They have to live in it 10 out of 12 months out of the year. We do an annual certification, and it adds value. City of Charlevoix is the one that spearheaded this, mainly because the data point that I mentioned before, that only 38% of their single-family homes are primary residentials, have primary residential exemption. So they're the only ones that are homesteaded. So it's a definite issue, and some local donors have stepped up to help fund that program.
Yeah, does anybody else on the panel want to add to that question, the impact of the short-term rental bill on ADUs? Don't want to go there. I would just add that the deed restriction program and ADU program have been piloted in Charlevoix County, but Housing North is working on additional funding to be able to bring these programs to other communities. So if that is an interest in your community, certainly reach out to us. I do have one other question that just came in. Sean, you mentioned the multifamily Traverse City neighborhoods were less desirable compared to outlying developments, and therefore TC converted to R1. At the same time, those multifamily houses were not cared for as a single family would, and the neighborhoods were being degraded. Once converted to single family, homeowners repaired and restored their homes, bringing them up to the much desired state we currently enjoy. Clearly, any increased density by ADUs need to protect neighbors so we don't repeat the same mistakes as we need to learn in the past. I guess I just thought there was a question coming there, but just wanted to see if you wanted to add to that at all.
Yeah, I mean, that's rhetoric that we hear quite a few times. And I don't deny that at that time. And if you talk to the people back in 1978, downtown was frankly a hellhole. You know, I was talking to property owners and they're like, yeah, we used to get beer bottles thrown through our front window. So I don't know that it's necessarily a result of how many people are living on the property, but maybe just how people were caring for property in general back then. And as we know, that was part of the post-urban core flight out of cities and disinvestment, and everything was moving to the community. So, I mean, I think we can recognize that, but let's have a more honest conversation about those issues. You know, I mentioned this a lot. Yeah, there's a single family home just down the street from me, and across there's a duplex. That duplex is owner occupied. One guy works in genetics at Munson Hospital. The other is a couple that owns a small business here in the Commons, you know, contributing members of society. Whereas a single family home, the cops are there constantly, dogs barking in the yard, trash, you know, it's not a factor of the single family versus the 2-family home. So let's talk about that and some of the other things that we can address. You know, that thing with parking, I hear that all the time too. That duplex across the street, between those 2 units, they own collectively 2 cars. Now the family of 4 down the street from me that have 2 kids in high school constantly have 4 cars parked there, you know? So again, it's not the number of people that live on the property. And I think we just need to have those conversations. And things are changing right now too. I mean, a lot of millennials saw their parents lose their shirt as they were preparing for retirement and the housing recession that occurred in 2008. And a lot of them have chosen not to buy houses. It's a choice to rent. And then what ends up happening is the job economy has changed. It used to be you finish school, you get a job, you work there, you get that pension. So you buy and you invest. Well, now people want to be mobile, and buying a home sometimes makes it more difficult to be mobile. And there's other explanations too as to why people rent besides being destitute. You know, I have a good childhood friend who they rented for 11 years and had 2 children in the same rental, and they invested in it and they took care of it. The reason they rented is his wife started 3 separate businesses during that time, and they needed to keep their capital free to make those investments happen. So again, we got to frame it broader than just renters bad, homeowners good, and that homeowners, single family homeowners are the only people able to invest and care for properties in our community.
Thanks, Sean. There was a comment earlier just about ADUs and septic systems and whether or not that makes them, I guess, a little bit more expensive to build or not. And I didn't know if anybody on the panel wanted to speak to that, or if that's a concern when investing in ADUs in rural areas where there isn't water or sewer.
Yeah, that would be a concern for sure, because you would have to accommodate for the additional living space, bathroom, bedroom, however your health department regulates that. So yeah, it can add to that for sure.
I think Emmett County or Tammy Dornberg is going to be on the next program, and her staff did a lot of research on that, and they found that it could be septic size is triggered by the number of bedrooms. So it depends on how that original system was sized or if there's any capacity in it. But they could potentially hook into an existing septic if there's capacity, or they could build their own if there's enough space on the site there. So it depends kind of a situation.
Muted. Trudy, there's a question for you in the chat. Does Leelanau County have jurisdiction and input on villages in the county, or do they have separate planning processes and requirements that might impact ADUs?
Every township and village in Leelanau County has its own zoning, and so they administer their own zoning. With regard to changes, by law, the County Planning Commission has to review any changes to zoning ordinances done by townships, as well as any changes to master plans done by townships or villages. So that would come through our office. We prepare a staff report, and it goes to the County Planning Commission, and then their review is sent back to the local jurisdiction. It is advisory only. They don't have teeth in it, but it's an advisory recommendation out to the local communities.
Thanks, Trudy. We did do a tracking of ADU ordinances, and I can share it with this email list for Leelanau or for the region, and that was done right before the end of 2021. That kind of looked at all the different ordinances and where they had ADU language or not. So we're kind of looking at it, but I know that, you know, we're looking for other example language too. And I believe the village of Suttons Bay did just make a recent recommendation to remove the owner occupancy requirement. They're looking at that. So a lot of, I would say a lot of units of government are looking into this right now and looking at example language that they can use.
Yeah, can I just add to that is some of the communities, what we found looking in their zoning ordinances don't actually state accessory dwelling units. They talk about accessory uses to the primary use. So they're looking at more like, you know, backyard sheds or, you know, garage or something like that, versus what we're talking about here is accessory dwelling units. So I encourage everyone to look at their zoning ordinances and see what it is they have listed in their definitions and how it's defined.
Yeah, when I worked in Sheboygan County, we never mentioned accessory dwelling units. However, historically, there was still language in there about guest cottages in certain districts. So, you know, we could work with that, and that was that allowed for that type of construction. We just had different terminology and older terminology. However, at that point, there was still the regulation, and I don't know if it's changed since then, that it had to be family or non-paying guests of the primary residents that live there. So although it seems like a simple amendment to remove that requirement, it really changes probably the historic intent of that guest cottage, but could open up those guest cottages for some important housing types.
So this is your last chance for questions before we wrap up. I did see there was one question in there about where the East Bay and Garfield Township are in these conversations. And I can just say from Housing North's perspective, we're trying to work with all of the units of government in our 10 county region and have certainly been sharing our housing ready checklist and talking with both of those townships. But Sean, do you want to help answer that?
Yeah, it's interesting. We get that a lot as we internally as the city try to explore what we can do to address housing. We get the what about Traverse City, or what about Garfield, what about East Bay? And unfortunately we can't control what they do, but I think it's worth recognizing their efforts. You know, in terms of affordable housing, Garfield is way above Traverse City in issuing pilots to alleviate taxes. They've been using that tool much greater than us. When you get into East Bay Township, they're building way more multifamily apartment buildings than we're building here in the city. So they are doing their part. The other thing that gets complicated, especially because when I worked in Acme, they didn't have water, no municipal water system. And outside of East Bay and Garfield, they don't really have that either. Well, you can't build to the density that most of the zoning allows because you can't meet the fire code. So there's limitations there because you have to have the infrastructure to build the density. And a lot of times those comments feel like we're just kind of kicking the can, but we all have to be part of this solution. And I think the ADUs are a great context sensitive solution for existing, you know, single family residential neighborhoods. This is how you can add that gentle infill without disrupting the character. And it's very intentional in our ordinance and how we've written it to protect that neighborhood character.
Thanks, Sean. Does anybody on the panel want to add anything, or does anybody, for some reason, somebody keeps sharing their screen. I'm sorry, I'm going to just stop that there. But does anybody have anything to add or want to ask any more questions before we wrap up?
Yeah, I'd like to add, just pulling some points out from each one of the speakers who did a wonderful job, is that we can see the need. Steve showed the data. There's a need for housing, especially smaller housing, not just in our local communities, but everywhere. So this is something we can look at. And the ADUs, to look at them being permitted anywhere there's single family, but also just where as an ADU to other uses. So in the farming community and in the business community and commercial and so forth. So they're not new uses. We've had them around for many, many years. They worked. So let's go back and take another look at them and see what we can do to help out with our housing situation.
Well said, Trudy. Well, I want to thank all of our panelists who joined us today. Thank you for your time. This is part one of a series, so we'll plan a part two where we'll dive in a little bit deeper to this topic and look at maybe some of the other barriers and some financing and other tools, and maybe even bring in some speakers from other communities outside Michigan that have done programs. So look out for that. We will be sending up a follow-up email with a link to the recording and some resources mentioned and the presentations for those interested. So everybody on the panel here, including myself, we're all a resource. We're here to help. So please feel free to reach out to us. And again, thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. I'm going to stop recording and